Hello, podcast listeners. You are now listening to the Coffee, Health, and Science podcast. I'm your host, Jordan River, and I want to thank you for tuning in today. Before we get started, as always, I urge you to share the show. Spread the Coffee, Health, and Science podcast. Tell a friend. Make sure you're subscribed so that you're notified every time we drop an episode. And give us a good review if you would. It really helps us out here at the Coffee, Health, and Science podcast. Today, it's just you and me. A little solo exploration. This one, unlike any other one we've done in the past. Today we seek to answer the question, hot coffee, how hot is too hot? More specifically, what is the perfect temperature for brewed coffee to exist and to be consumed? This exploration led me down a deep rabbit hole, and I'm excited to tour this wormhole with you today. So strap on your seatbelts. It's time for some hot coffee. In 1994, on a morning like any other, 79-year-old Stella Liebeck was going through a McDonald's drive-thru when she ordered a hot cup of coffee. As she was receiving the coffee, she placed the cup between her legs, and when she went to adjust it, the piping, scalding coffee spilled all over her, causing her to receive burns from the scalding brew. Now, perhaps you're already familiar with this case and you know where I'm going here, but don't tune out just yet. Because, you see, I'm old enough to remember this incident from my childhood and the resulting lawsuit. And I specifically remember the way which public opinion kind of cemented, the way that it was portrayed, the way that public consensus landed on the subject. When Stella went to take legal action against McDonald's and actually brought forth a lawsuit, the public conception was that this was an example of a frivolous lawsuit, someone gaming the system for money. By the end of this whole media coverage of this case, you almost thought that it was a cash grab, headlines reading that Stella was awarded $2.9 million over hot coffee she ordered being too hot. But there is actually quite a bit more to this story once I dug in to take a look at the details, and it plays very nicely into our theme today. You see, the coffee that was served to poor old Stella, the coffee that was being sold in the 80s and 90s at McDonald's, it was too hot. Quite a bit too hot. 190-degree coffee can cause serious third-degree burns in mere seconds. Let me explain. During the 1990s and 80s, McDonald's had intentionally set their policy to keep their coffee pots at a steady 180 to 190 degrees Fahrenheit, some 20 degrees higher than most restaurants, and only 5 degrees under some brewing temperatures. Because at the end of the day, no one wants cold coffee, right? So you heat it up extra hot, it'll stay hotter for longer for the whole ride home. McDonald's wasn't blind to this overheating issue. During this time, the corporation had received over 700 complaints from coffee burns, but didn't have any plans on changing the policy. That was until Mrs. Liebeck's lawsuit and the whole incident. And the incident was no trivial matter, by the way. This woman was seriously burned. She spent 7 days in the hospital. When she approached McDonald's about the bills, the medical bills, before the lawsuit, they offered her an $800 payout. So no wonder she took it to court. And after the initial award, I saw $2.9 million, $2.7 million, having that reduced to some $600,000, and then settling for a lesser, undisclosed amount to avoid an appeal. McDonald's actually felt some sting after that, and they would change their corporate policy to lower the temperature of the coffee that was served. And you'll also find warnings now adorning all of the coffee cups at McDonald's and other chains as well. So you may remember the headlines of this case, but who knew there was so much to the hot coffee battle of 1994? But that does beg the question, how hot is too hot? how hot should coffee be served? Well, you certainly don't want to burn your mouth. That's a good starting point. But as a coffee connoisseur, you're going to want to consider how the serving temperature affects the flavor of your coffee. That's right. Serving temperature alters the taste of your end brew, just like roasting temperature and brewing temperature. In fact, coffee should be brewed between 195 and 205 degrees Fahrenheit, and then cooled to your preferred drinking temperature. Now, with all the research that I've done in this episode, I can't find anywhere that suggests that you ever serve coffee over 185 degrees Fahrenheit. And even that 180 to 185 degree range that I had found at the top of the recommendations, it specifically is recommended for the warming sensation that you get from the extra hot beverages, not for taste by any means. And to be clear, I do understand this phenomenon. I love piping hot beverages. I love food served sizzling hot. I want to burn my mouth on a good slice of pizza. I want it so hot out of the oven that I want it to destroy some of my mouth matter as I am consuming the slice itself. So I get the idea of heat for heat's sake, but we're after flavor here when we're drinking our coffee, and that's what we're focusing in on with this podcast today. If you drink your coffee in the 155 to 175 degree range, you're going to find more well-rounded notes, more sweet notes, and more bitter flavors. Many people would say a more robust profile. Whereas if you take your coffee a bit cooler in the 120 to 140 degree range, you'll get more of those acidic, brighter, sharper notes and flavors coming out. And if you've ever sipped on old, cold, or lukewarm coffee, you've experienced this shift in flavor. Sometimes a coffee that's been sitting around with milk in it, for instance, or cream, it'll take on a totally different taste than when it was fresh. Usually when the coffee dips below 120 degrees, people seek to reheat it. And reheating coffee is really never recommended by the experts, as it's going to drastically change the flavor, but sometimes you gotta do what you gotta do. If this subject of serving temperature is interesting to you and you want to do some testing of your own, simply get yourself a cheap little metal probe cooking thermometer or meat thermometer. The digital ones are best, and start taking note of different drinking temperatures and which ones you like. Or if you want to get really fancy and maybe do a multiple brew comparison, just grab one of those infrared laser thermometers, wait until your cups are at different temperatures, and then taste them side by side. That would really let you know the differences in flavors. Maybe that's a little overboard, I will admit. But just keep in mind that every second counts when your coffee is cooling. Every second counts with coffee in general. Remember that coffee with milk or cream holds its warmth for longer. And don't forget the rule of 15 when it comes to coffee. Let me remind you, if you're a new listener, about the rule of 15. Green coffee beans, once harvested, are good for 15 months before roasting. Roasted coffee is best consumed within 15 days. And after grinding, coffee should be brewed within 15 minutes. That is how we do it here on the Coffee Health and Science podcast. But maybe you're asking, Jordan, you still haven't given me the answer. What is the answer? You've given me ranges to work with here, but what is the number one best temperature to serve coffee at? Well, although I stand by my previous statement about preference, I might recommend that you consult the experts. You can find an actual, real research paper on PubMed's public website entitled Calculating the Optimum Temperature for Serving Hot Beverages. That's right, doctors, or rather researchers, sat down and tirelessly applied their scientific minds and principles to this very topic, and they wrote an entire research paper on it. It's actually quite funny. Let me read a little bit from this paper. It is eye-opening. Quote, hot beverages such as tea, hot chocolate, and coffee are frequently served between 160 degrees Fahrenheit and 185 degrees Fahrenheit. Brief exposures to liquids in this temperature range can cause significant scald burns. However, hot beverages must be served at a temperature that is high enough to provide a satisfactory sensation to the consumer. This paper presents an analysis to quantify hot beverage temperatures that balance limiting the potential scald burn hazard and maintaining an acceptable perception of adequate product warmth. End quote. That is the most wonderful egghead jargon I've ever heard when it comes to we need coffee to be hot, not too hot that it burns people, but still acceptable. So funny. And after all this research, what did these eggheads learn about coffee temperature? Well, let's take a look further in the paper here. Quote, the preferred drinking temperature of coffee is specified in the literature as 140 degrees Fahrenheit, plus or minus 15 degrees. And this was from a population of 300 subjects. So I find that actually really interesting. So minus 15 degrees, you're down at 125. Plus 15 degrees, you're up to 155. That is, and it's a pretty small sample size, the 300 subjects, but that is very, very interesting. That range there is apparently the preferred drinking temperature when it comes to this piece of literature. The paper continues. A linear figure of merit merged the two effects to identify an optimal drinking temperature of approximately 136 degrees Fahrenheit. The analysis points to a reduction in the presently recommended serving temperature of coffee to achieve the combined result of reducing the scald burn hazard and improving customer satisfaction. End quote. So the two things they were looking for, not causing scald burns but still being satisfying, they landed at 136 degrees, lower than I think a lot of, well, obviously that's what the study says. We're overheating our served coffee. We're serving it too hot out there on average. So there you have it, 136 degrees Fahrenheit. The laws of science have confirmed it, folks. Now, my personal thought is, no one consumes their mug of coffee in one sip, right? And if 136 degrees is perfect, you kind of want it hotter than optimal, so it cools into your desired zone. But who am I to argue with the experts? And I guess that leaves the one last point that I wanted to make here. After doing all this research about the optimal serving temperature of coffee, I didn't see any reference to cold brew. I'll have to bring this up to Dr. Coffee. It's a crime. Cold brewed coffee is an excellent, less acidic way to consume the beverage. And I know when you get into the Google rabbit hole of hot coffee, you're going to wind up with a lot of how hot should hot coffee be, but I expected at least one nod, one clever wink to cold brew, and I saw nothing. So don't sleep on the cold brew, folks. The Coffee, Health, and Science podcast is about coffee in all different shapes and sizes and temperatures, including the great iced coffee and cold brew coffee. I hope you enjoyed this very unique episode. I thought it was an interesting little exploration. I hope you found it to be entertaining and enlightening. And we'll be back next week, every Saturday, with more Coffee, Health, and Science podcast. I've got some coffee history in the works, some new interviews. Dr. Coffee will be returning. You guys know the drill. Thank you so much for listening. This is Jordan River signing off for now, saying have an extraordinary day out there, everybody. We will see you next time on the Coffee, Health, and Science podcast. Bye-bye, everyone. Don't drink that coffee too hot.